My sister called me irrelevant at her medical school graduation, telling everyone I was just some nurse who never made anything of herself after the army. I stood there in the same scrubs I'd worn performing emergency surgery on a senator's daughter hours before. Then her resident supervisor walked over and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dr. Chen? Aren't you supposed to be at Johns Hopkins prepping for tomorrow's neurosurgery conference where you're the keynote speaker?" The room went silent, and my sister finally had nothing to say. The ballroom at the Meridian Hotel buzzed with celebration as Dr. Jessica Chen's medical school graduating class mingled with family and faculty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over proud parents and accomplished students, all toasting the beginning of brilliant medical careers. I stood near the dessert table, invisible as always, watching my younger sister bask in the attention she'd craved since childhood. "Jessica has such a promising future," Dr. Williams, the residency director, was saying to a cluster of admiring relatives. "Top 10% of her class, excellent bedside manner, real potential for cardiothoracic surgery." My Aunt Margaret beamed like she'd personally guided Jessica through medical school. "We always knew she'd be the doctor in the family. Such dedication, such intelligence." She glanced at me with that familiar mixture of pity and disappointment. "Not like some people who just drifted after the military." Drifted. I almost laughed. If only she knew that yesterday I'd spent 14 hours in surgery removing a brain tumor from a federal judge, or that next week I'd be consulting on a case that involved separating conjoined twins at the skull. Jessica approached our little family circle, radiant in her white coat, stethoscope draped around her neck like a trophy. "Everyone, I want you to meet Dr. Rodriguez, my neurology attending." She gestured to a distinguished man in his 50s. "This is my family, and this is my sister Lisa." Dr. Rodriguez smiled politely and shook hands around the circle. When he reached me, Jessica added with a laugh that cut like a scalpel, "Lisa's the one I told you about. She never really found her direction after the army. She works as a nurse at some community clinic now." "A nurse," Dr. Rodriguez repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "Well, she calls herself a nurse practitioner, but really she just takes blood pressure and gives flu shots," Jessica continued, and several cousins chuckled. "We keep hoping she'll find something more substantial. Maybe go back to school. Get some real medical training?" Real medical training. I thought about my residency at Mass General, my fellowship in pediatric neurosurgery at Boston Children's, the countless hours I'd spent learning to navigate the most complex organ in the human body with microscopic precision. "The thing about Lisa," my mother Patricia added with that tone of maternal disappointment I knew so well, "is that she's always been the dreamer. Remember when she used to say she wanted to be a brain surgeon? Such big ideas for someone who barely made it through her basic medical courses." Barely made it through. I'd graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Medical School, but they'd somehow rewritten that history to fit their narrative of me as the family underachiever. "I think it's wonderful that she found work that suits her capabilities," Jessica said with false kindness. "Not everyone can handle the pressure of real medicine. Community health is important too, in its own way." I nodded and smiled, the same diplomatic expression I'd perfected during hostile questioning from hospital boards when my unconventional surgical techniques challenged established protocols. These people had no idea that the community clinic was actually my cover story, that I spent my days performing the most complex neurosurgeries on the East Coast. "Lisa's always been content with simple things," my father, David, said with a paternal sigh. "Small apartment, basic job, no real ambitions." Sometimes I wonder if the military changed her, made her less motivated. Less motivated. 3 days ago, I'd operated for 18 straight hours to save a child's life, pioneering a technique that would be published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But to them, I was still the disappointing older sister who'd never lived up to Jessica's obvious brilliance. I excused myself from the family circle and stepped onto the hotel's outdoor terrace, pulling out my encrypted phone to check the messages I'd been ignoring all evening. 12 missed calls from Johns Hopkins. 6 from the NIH. A text marked urgent from Dr. Sarah Kim, the chief of neurosurgery, about tomorrow's groundbreaking procedure. The weight of my double life pressed against my chest like the lead aprons we wore during complex imaging procedures. Every dismissive comment, every casual assumption about my simple life, carved deeper into the carefully constructed barrier between who they thought I was and who I actually was. "Lisa, you okay out here?" Jessica had followed me onto the terrace, her heels clicking against the stone tiles. "You look stressed. Problems at the clinic?" "Something like that," I murmured, quickly sliding the phone back into my pocket. Jessica didn't need to know there was no community clinic, that my real office was a state-of-the-art surgical suite where I performed operations that made medical history. "You know, I've been thinking," she continued, leaning against the marble railing with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "Maybe it's time you considered a career change. You've been stuck in that nursing thing for years now. There's no shame in admitting it's not working out." Stuck in that nursing thing. If she only knew I'd just been offered the position of department head at 3 different prestigious hospitals, or that medical students from around the world competed for the chance to observe my surgeries. "I mean, look at tonight," Jessica gestured back toward the ballroom where her classmates were networking with attending physicians. "These are the people who are going to change medicine, who are going to save lives, make real contributions to healthcare. Don't you want to be part of something meaningful?" Something meaningful. Yesterday I'd removed a tumor from a 7-year-old's brainstem, a procedure so delicate that one tremor could have left her paralyzed for life. Last week I'd consulted on a case involving a soldier who'd suffered traumatic brain injury, using techniques I'd developed during my deployment in Afghanistan to restore function that other surgeons said was impossible. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine where I am." Jessica laughed, the sound sharp against the evening air. "Lisa, you're 36 and living like a resident. When I was your age, well actually, when I'm your age, I'll already be making 6 figures as a cardiothoracic surgeon. You're still whatever it is you do at that little clinic." What I did at that little clinic was revolutionize pediatric neurosurgery. 2 months ago, I'd published research that changed how we approach spinal cord tumors in children. Next week, I'd be delivering the keynote address at the International Neurosurgical Conference, presenting techniques that would influence surgical practice for the next decade. "Maybe I could talk to Dr. Rodriguez," Jessica offered, referring to her attending physician. "See if he knows of any openings for medical assistants or something. Better hours, better pay than whatever you're making now. More realistic than whatever dreams you're still chasing. Medical assistant." I thought about my surgical schedule tomorrow, where I'd be operating on cases that other neurosurgeons deemed inoperable. I thought about the research grants I'd been awarded, the patents I held for surgical instruments I'd designed, the textbook I'd co-authored that was required reading in medical schools across the country. "That's very thoughtful," I managed, maintaining the same calm demeanor I'd learned during my military service when dealing with impossible situations. "But I think I'll stick with my current path." Jessica shrugged with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never had to prove herself. "Your choice. But don't wait too long, Lisa. Medicine is changing rapidly, and if you're not keeping up..." The vibration against my hip came at exactly 10:23 p.m., cutting through Jessica's detailed explanation of her residency rotation schedule. My secure phone, the one reserved for medical emergencies that couldn't wait, was buzzing with an incoming call marked Johns Hopkins code red. I glanced back at the ballroom where my family continued celebrating, completely unaware that somewhere in Baltimore, a surgical crisis was unfolding that required my immediate attention. Jessica was still talking about her future plans, her voice filled with the confidence of someone who'd never had to operate under fire. "Dr. Chen speaking," I whispered, stepping further into the shadows of the terrace. "Lisa, thank God we reached you." Dr. Michael Torres, the chief of emergency surgery, sounded strained. "We have a 7-year-old girl. Car accident. Severe traumatic brain injury with active hemorrhaging. The family specifically requested you. They flew in from Denver because they said you're the only surgeon in the country who successfully operated on this type of brainstem injury in children." My blood pressure spiked the way it used to during combat missions when every second meant the difference between life and death. This was the type of case that defined careers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The kind of surgery that other neurosurgeons wouldn't even attempt. What's the timeline? I asked, already calculating how long it would take to get from here to Baltimore. She's stable for now, but barely. We need you in Oregon 7 within 2 hours, 3 maximum. The hemorrhaging is increasing, and if we wait until morning... His voice trailed off, but I understood. By morning, there might not be anything left to save. I looked through the glass doors at my family, still toasting Jessica's achievements and discussing my apparent lack of direction. They thought her completion of medical school was the pinnacle of medical accomplishment. They had no idea their disappointing daughter was about to attempt a surgery that would be written about in medical journals for decades. Dr. Chen, are you there? Yes, I'm here. I'll need a helicopter to the nearest helipad. This can't wait for commercial flights. Already arranged. Military transport is en route to your location. ETA 12 minutes. Military transport. The phrase brought back memories of emergency evacuations in Afghanistan, of operating in field hospitals while mortars exploded around us. But this was different. This was a child whose parents had researched every neurosurgeon in North America and specifically asked for me. And Lisa? Dr. Torres's voice softened slightly. The parents want to meet with you before the surgery. They've read every paper you've published on pediatric brainstem injuries. They know about the soldier you saved in Kandahar, the technique you pioneered for spinal cord reconstruction. They trust you because they know your record. My record. While my family spent years suggesting I find more realistic career goals, parents across the country were seeking me out because I'd built a reputation for saving children. Other surgeons couldn't help. I understand. I'll be there. One more thing. This is going to be high profile. Senator Martinez's granddaughter. The media will be watching, and the hospital board wants to make sure we have our best people on this. I looked back at Jessica, still glowing in her white coat, surrounded by family members praising her potential. In 2 hours, I'd be performing a surgery that would determine whether a 7-year-old girl lived or died. But first, I had to explain to my family why their simple clinic nurse was abandoning another family celebration for yet another mysterious emergency. I straightened my shoulders and walked back toward the celebration, knowing this might be the last family gathering where they saw me as small. 3 days later, I found myself standing in the back of the University Medical Center's grand auditorium, watching Jessica present her senior research project to a room full of medical faculty and fellow students. She was discussing basic cardiac anatomy with the enthusiasm of someone discovering fire, while I tried to stay awake after performing emergency brain surgery for 16 straight hours. My family filled the front row like a cheering section at the Super Bowl. My parents beamed with pride. My Aunt Margaret live-streamed portions for Facebook, and even my usually stoic Uncle Robert had taken time off work to witness Jessica's, quote, groundbreaking presentation on congenital heart defects. I'd slipped in quietly through the back entrance, hoping to show support, despite the exhaustion that made my hands shake slightly. The surgery on Senator Martinez's granddaughter had been successful, but the media attention was still building. 3 major news networks had requested interviews about the miracle surgery that saved the 7-year-old's life. Jessica was finding her rhythm now, clicking through PowerPoint slides about basic cardiac procedures. As you can see, the traditional approach to ventricular septal defects requires careful consideration of the patient's age, the size of the defect, and potential complications. She was explaining procedures I'd mastered during my first year of residency, but the audience was engaged, nodding along as if witnessing revolutionary medical insights. That's when the auditorium's main doors opened with a soft whoosh, and Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the hospital's chief of cardiothoracic surgery, stepped inside. She wore her formal white coat, the one reserved for important hospital business, and her expression was serious as she scanned the crowded room. My stomach dropped. Not here. Not now. Not in front of Jessica's entire medical school class and our entire family. Dr. Rodriguez's eyes found mine in the back of the auditorium. and she began walking purposefully down the center aisle. Every step echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Jessica paused mid-sentence, confusion flickering across her face as this distinguished surgeon approached her audience. "Excuse me," Jessica called out, her newfound confidence wavering. "Dr. Rodriguez, if you have business with the medical school, perhaps we could speak after my presentation." Dr. Rodriguez didn't slow down. She walked directly past the front row where my family sat, past the faculty table, straight to where I stood in the back. The entire auditorium had turned to stare. Students, professors, my family, everyone. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I apologize for interrupting, but Johns Hopkins is requesting your immediate consultation on the Martinez case follow-up. The family specifically asked for you to review the post-surgical imaging, and the media is waiting for your statement about the innovative techniques you used." The words hit the room like a defibrillator shock. I watched my mother's face go white, saw my father's mouth fall open, witnessed Jessica's confident presentation collapse into pure bewilderment. "I'm sorry," Jessica stammered from the podium, "but there must be some mistake. That's my sister Lisa. She's not a doctor, she works at a community clinic as a nurse." Dr. Rodriguez turned slightly toward Jessica, her expression professionally courteous but firm. "Miss Chen, I'm addressing Dr. Lisa Elena Chen, Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, recipient of the Henderson Award for Surgical Innovation, and the surgeon who just saved Senator Martinez's granddaughter with a procedure that's being called the most complex pediatric brain surgery ever attempted." The silence that followed was so complete, you could hear the air conditioning cycling through the vents. My family's faces showed a spectrum of shock that would have been comical if it weren't so painful. I straightened my spine and nodded to Dr. Rodriguez. "Tell them I'll be there within the hour." Jessica's presentation was forgotten. Her moment of academic triumph had just been eclipsed by the revelation that her irrelevant sister was one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. I left Dr. Rodriguez waiting in the hallway and walked directly to my family, still frozen in their front row seats like patients who'd just received a devastating diagnosis. The medical students whispered among themselves, phones already out, Googling my name to verify what they'd just heard. Jessica stood behind the podium looking like someone had just told her everything she knew about medicine was wrong. "We need to talk," I said quietly to my parents. "All of us." Somewhere private. 15 minutes later, we sat in an empty conference room at the medical center. The same type of room where I'd delivered countless surgical consultations to families facing impossible decisions. The institutional furniture that had seemed so impressive to Jessica suddenly felt small compared to the boardrooms at Johns Hopkins, where I'd presented groundbreaking research to international medical panels. "Lisa," my mother began, her voice trembling, "what just happened out there? That surgeon, she called you the Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery. That's impossible. You work at a clinic. You told us you were a nurse practitioner." "I never told you I was a nurse practitioner," I said gently. "You assumed that, and I stopped correcting you." The silence stretched between us like the space between a surgeon's blade and a patient's brain tissue. Millimeters that meant everything. "But your apartment," Jessica finally found her voice. "Your car, your clothes. You live like someone who's struggling financially." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd carried for 2 years, waiting for this moment. Inside were photographs. Me in surgical scrubs standing over complex operations, awards ceremonies where I'd received international recognition, news articles about my military service and surgical innovations. Dr. Lisa Elena Chen, I read from an official hospital document. Appointed Chief of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins at age 34. Youngest department head in hospital history. Published researcher with 43 peer-reviewed articles. Recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for surgical innovations developed during military service in Afghanistan. My father picked up one of the photographs with shaking hands. "This is you operating on, is that a child?" "That's the surgery I developed for treating traumatic brain injuries in combat zones," I explained. "I adapted it for pediatric use after seeing too many children with injuries that other surgeons called inoperable." Jessica slumped into her chair, staring at the evidence of my real life spread across the conference table. I don't understand. Why would you let us think you were struggling? Why didn't you tell us you were successful? I looked at each of them. These people who had spent years offering me career advice while I was literally saving lives. Because every time I tried to share any achievement, you found ways to diminish it. When I graduated medical school, you said I was showing off. When I matched into neurosurgery residency, you said I was biting off more than I could chew. When I deployed to Afghanistan as a combat surgeon, you said I was running away from real responsibility. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We never said those things. You said all of those things and more, I continued, my voice steady despite years of accumulated pain. So when Johns Hopkins offered me the department head position, when I started performing surgeries that made medical history, when I began teaching techniques that are now standard practice in pediatric neurosurgery, I decided to see how long it would take for you to notice. How long before you realized that your directionless daughter had become one of the leading neurosurgeons in the world. The room fell quiet except for the distant sound of hospital equipment humming through the walls. 2 years, I said finally. It took 2 years, and you only found out because a patient needed me. My father was the first to break the silence, his hands trembling as he set down the photograph of me receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Lisa, how could we not see this? Our daughter is saving children's lives and we thought she was struggling to make ends meet. Because you never asked, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. You never once asked me about my work, my goals, my life. You just assumed that because I lived modestly and didn't talk about money, I must be failing. Jessica leaned forward, her medical school confidence completely shattered. But why didn't you correct us? When I was talking about becoming a doctor, when I was explaining basic procedures to you like you'd never seen the inside of a hospital, why didn't you just tell me you were already performing surgeries I can't even pronounce? The question hung in the air like anesthesia, numbing and inescapable. Because I wanted to see if anyone in this family would ever be curious enough about my actual life to discover I wasn't the failure you all assumed I was. My mother's face crumpled. We never thought you were a failure, Lisa. We worried about you. After you came back from Afghanistan, you seemed so different, so intense. We thought if we could encourage you to find something calmer, something safer. Safer? I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the medical center where Jessica was just beginning to understand what real medicine looked like. I operated on soldiers while rockets exploded overhead. I performed brain surgery in field hospitals without proper equipment. I developed techniques that saved hundreds of lives in combat zones. But you thought I needed protection from what? Success? We were intimidated, my father admitted quietly. Even before we knew about this, he gestured at the photographs and awards. You were always the smartest one in the room. When you talked about medicine during family dinners, we felt stupid. When you mentioned your work, we didn't understand half of what you were saying. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. I spent 2 years explaining basic medical concepts to you. I taught you about blood pressure and heart rates like you were a child. And all this time you were performing surgeries that I'll probably never even observe, let alone perform. That's not the point, I said, my voice breaking despite my attempts to stay composed. This isn't about comparing our achievements. This is about 2 years of family gatherings where you talked about me like I was broken. 2 years of career advice from people who assumed I was incompetent without ever asking what I actually did for a living. My Aunt Margaret, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. Lisa, we're proud of Jessica because we understood her path. Medical school, residency, it's a clear progression. But you disappeared into the military, then into some job we couldn't understand. We didn't know how to celebrate what we couldn't see. You couldn't see it because you never looked, I replied. You saw my apartment and my clothes, and decided that told you everything about my life. You never asked about my patients, my research, my innovations. You never wondered why I worked such strange hours or why I traveled so frequently for training. The room fell silent except for Jessica's quiet crying. She looked up at me, mascara streaked down her cheeks. I called you irrelevant, in front of everyone. I said you never made anything of yourself. You did, I confirmed. And it wasn't the first time. My mother reached across the table toward me. How do we fix this? How do we fix 2 years of not seeing our own daughter? I looked at her outstretched hand, then at the faces around the table. I don't know if you can. 10 days later, my secure phone rang at 2:47 a.m. with the call I'd been dreading since the family confrontation. The caller ID showed Johns Hopkins emergency, and my heart sank as I answered. Dr. Chen, this is Dr. Sarah Kim. We have a critical situation that requires your immediate attention. I sat up in bed, instantly alert, despite having just finished a 12-hour surgery the day before. I'm listening. 22-year-old female, motorcycle accident, severe traumatic brain injury with multiple skull fractures and brain swelling. She's been life-flighted from Virginia ETA, 30 minutes. Dr. Chen? It's Jessica. The world stopped. Everything I'd learned about maintaining surgical composure, about emotional detachment during crisis situations, evaporated in an instant. My Jessica? My sister? Yes. She was riding with friends after her residency match celebration. The family is en route, but they specifically requested you. They said you're the only surgeon they trust with her life. I was already getting dressed, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind raced through everything that could go wrong with this type of injury. Jessica's face flashed in my memory. Not the dismissive sister from the medical conference, but the little girl who used to bandage her dolls and dream of being a doctor. What's her Glasgow coma scale? 7 and dropping. Dr. Chen, I need you to know, this is exactly the type of injury you pioneered treatment for in Afghanistan. The multiple trauma protocol you developed. If anyone can save her, it's you. I arrived at Johns Hopkins 30 minutes before the helicopter, using the time to review Jessica's incoming scans and assemble my surgical team. The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister, who had spent years dismissing my medical expertise, was now depending on techniques I'd developed in combat zones she'd never understood. When the trauma bay doors burst open, I saw my parents running behind the gurney, my mother sobbing and my father's face gray with terror. They spotted me in my surgical scrubs and ran toward me. Lisa, please, my mother grabbed my arm. Please save her. We know you can save her. We've been reading about your surgeries, your innovations. That little girl you saved last week, the senator's granddaughter. Please do the same thing for Jessica. My father's voice was breaking. We're sorry. We're so sorry we didn't see who you really were. But please, don't let our mistakes cost Jessica her life. She's all we have left. I looked down at my sister on the gurney, unconscious, her young face swollen and bruised. All the arguments, all the dismissiveness, all the years of being treated as irrelevant. None of it mattered now. She was my sister, and she was dying. Dr. Chen? The trauma nurse was waiting for my assessment. Shucks. I moved to Jessica's side, my training taking over. Her pupils were unequal and slowly reactive. The pressure in her skull was building. Every minute we delayed increased the likelihood of permanent brain damage or death. Prep Oregon 7, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. This is going to be the most complex surgery of my career. And Jessica, I whispered to her unconscious form, you're going to witness firsthand exactly what your irrelevant sister is capable of. The surgery began at 4:23 a.m. and would determine whether Jessica lived to apologize for all the words that could never be taken back. 8 hours after Jessica's surgery, I found my parents in the hospital family lounge, looking like they'd aged years in a single night. My father held a folder I'd never seen before, his hands shaking as he opened it to reveal its contents. Lisa, he began, his voice hoarse from crying. Before we say anything else, I need to show you something we should have shown you years ago. Inside the folder were medical journals, newspaper clippings, printed emails, and screenshots from medical websites. Dozens of them, dating back to my residency. Every article about my surgical innovations, every mention of my military service, every award I'd received. Headlines about my work that I'd assumed no one in my family had noticed. We knew, my mother said quietly, her eyes red from hours of tears. We've known about your real career since the beginning. The words hit me harder than any diagnosis I'd ever delivered. What? My father pulled out a subscription renewal notice for the Journal of Pediatric Neurosurgery. I've subscribed to every medical journal that publishes your work. I set up Google Alerts for your name the day you graduated medical school. We've read every paper you've published, watched every interview you've given. I stared at the collection of articles, my world tilting on its axis. But you never said anything. You kept calling me a nurse. You kept suggesting I change careers. Because we were terrified, my mother whispered. Do you understand what it's like to know your daughter operates on children's brains? To know she developed surgical techniques while people were shooting at her? To read about the soldiers you saved and realize that our daughter was in constant mortal danger? My father picked up one of the articles, dated from my deployment. This piece about the field hospital in Kandahar, where you performed emergency brain surgery during a rocket attack. We didn't sleep for weeks after reading it. That doesn't excuse, I started. No, it doesn't, my mother interrupted. Nothing excuses how we treated you. But I need you to understand why. She pulled out a printed email thread. After that article was published, I wrote to you 17 times asking if you were safe, if you needed anything, if you wanted to come home. You never responded. I remembered those emails. I'd been so focused on saving lives that personal correspondence felt trivial by comparison. I was trying to concentrate on my work. And we thought you were pulling away from us, my father said. We thought that your success meant you didn't need your ordinary family anymore. So we decided to try to keep you grounded, to treat you like regular people instead of the medical celebrity you'd become. My Aunt Margaret, who had arrived during the surgery, spoke up. Lisa, when Jessica was explaining basic medical procedures to you, we thought we were helping you stay connected to normal family life. We didn't realize we were insulting your expertise. We were afraid, my mother continued, that if we constantly talked about your achievements, you'd realize how far beyond us you'd grown, that you'd stop coming to family dinners because we couldn't contribute anything meaningful to conversations about neurosurgery and military medicine. I looked around at these people who had raised me, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. So you decided to pretend I was failing instead? We decided to pretend you were still the daughter who needed us, my father admitted. The daughter who would always be part of our world, not the surgeon who belonged in a different stratosphere entirely. The irony was devastating. While I'd thought they were dismissing my achievements, they'd been desperately trying to hold on to me in the only way they knew how. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the International Medical Center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of neurosurgeons, medical residents, and healthcare professionals who had gathered for the annual symposium on pediatric neurosurgical innovation. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. The same week my family had spent years suggesting I find more realistic career goals, I was being honored with the Humanitarian Medal of Excellence for developing surgical techniques that had saved over 200 children's lives. But today was different. For the first time since my medical career began, my entire family sat in the front row. My parents had driven down from Philadelphia, my father wearing a tie with tiny stethoscopes on it that he'd bought specifically for medical events. My mother sat beside him, holding a program with my photo on the cover, tears already forming in her eyes. Jessica was there too, still recovering from her accident, but insistent on attending, wearing the surgical scar on her temple like a badge of honor and a reminder of how close we'd come to losing each other. Even my extended family had come, Aunt Margaret, Uncle Robert, cousins who had previously shown little interest in my work. They filled an entire row, looking simultaneously proud and slightly overwhelmed by the medical terminology surrounding them. Ladies and gentlemen, the moderator announced, it is my honor to present Dr. Lisa Elena Chen, whose pioneering work in pediatric trauma neurosurgery has revolutionized how we approach complex brain injuries in children. Her techniques, developed initially in combat zones, have been adopted by children's hospitals worldwide. The applause was immediate and sustained. I looked down at my notes, then set them aside. After years of hiding my achievements from the people who mattered most, it was time to speak not just as a surgeon, but as a daughter, sister, and woman who had learned that vulnerability and strength could coexist. Thank you for this incredible honor, I began. When I developed the Chen protocol for pediatric traumatic brain injury, I was working in a field hospital in Afghanistan, trying to save a 7-year-old boy who had been injured in an explosion. What I didn't know was that 6 months later, I would use that same technique to save my own sister's life. I gestured toward Jessica, who stood and waved to the audience. The applause was immediate and emotional. This brings me to something I rarely discuss publicly: the personal cost of medical achievement when your family doesn't understand your work. For nearly 3 years, my family believed I was struggling as a community health nurse, while I was actually serving as chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. This wasn't because of HIPAA requirements or professional discretion. It was because I had lost faith that the people who loved me could also respect the person I'd become professionally. A murmur went through the audience. Medical journalists were taking notes, sensing a story that went beyond typical medical conference fare. The night before I operated on my sister, I sat in my office reading her medical scans, knowing that everything I'd learned about brain trauma, from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the operating rooms of Johns Hopkins, would determine whether she lived or died. I realized that the isolation I'd maintained wasn't protecting anyone. It was preventing my family from understanding the work that had shaped every aspect of my adult life. I paused, looking directly at my family in the front row. Jessica was crying, but she was also recording the speech on her phone, wanting to capture this moment for posterity. Medical expertise isn't just about technical skill and scientific knowledge. It's about human connection, understanding that every patient has a family that loves them, fears for them, hopes for their recovery. When I operated on my sister, I wasn't just applying surgical techniques I'd learned in medical school. I was using everything I'd learned about love, fear, responsibility, and the weight of holding someone else's future in your hands. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Jessica's accident taught our family something profound about communication and assumption. For years, they had dismissed my work because they were afraid of how dangerous it was, how far it might take me from them. They treated me like a struggling nurse because they thought it would keep me safely within their understanding. What they didn't realize was that their dismissal was pushing me away far more effectively than my surgical schedule ever could. I looked at my father, whose face showed a mixture of pride and remorse that would probably never fully fade. After Jessica's surgery, when she was recovering in the ICU, she asked me something that changed how I think about my career. She said, "Lisa, how many families have you saved? How many children are alive today because of techniques you developed?" When I told her the numbers, over 200 successful pediatric brain surgeries, 15 new techniques now used internationally, she cried. Not because she was impressed, but because she realized she had spent years dismissing work that was literally saving children's lives. The applause began slowly, building to a standing ovation that lasted nearly 4 minutes. But I wasn't watching the crowd. I was watching Jessica mouth the words, "I'm proud of you," while my mother held up a sign she'd made that read, "Drive Lisa Chen, our hero." After the ceremony, as medical professionals approached to discuss surgical techniques and research collaborations, my family waited patiently at the edge of the crowd. When the last handshake was finished, and the final interview was complete, Jessica was the first to reach me. "Lisa," she said, embracing me carefully around her healing injuries, "I need to say something I should have said 3 years ago. You're not just my sister, you're my hero. Not because you're famous or successful, but because you chose to save lives, even when the people who should have been cheering you on were too blind to see your greatness." For the first time in years, I felt like both Dr. Chen and simply Lisa. And for the first time in my life, my family was celebrating both versions of me. 1 year later, I walked into the Johns Hopkins Pediatric Surgery Training Center, where I'd agreed to conduct a masterclass on advanced neurosurgical techniques. The room was filled with medical residents and young surgeons from around the world, all eager to learn procedures that had once seemed impossible. But in the front row sat an unexpected student. Jessica, now a second-year resident, having switched from cardiology to neurosurgery after her accident. "I want to understand your world," she'd told me 6 months ago when she announced her specialty change. "I want to save children the way you saved me." Beside her sat my parents, who had become regular attendees at medical conferences since what my mother called the awakening. My father now volunteered with a veterans medical outreach program, using his engineering background to help design better surgical instruments. "I can't operate like you," he'd told me, "but I can make sure you have the best tools possible." My mother had started a support group for families of military medical personnel, helping other parents understand the unique challenges their children faced serving in combat zones. She'd become an advocate for military medical recognition, something I never could have imagined during the years she worried I was wasting my potential. "Good morning, future neurosurgeons," I began, looking out at the eager faces of residents who reminded me of myself a decade ago. "Today we're going to discuss the Chen protocol for pediatric trauma surgery, but I want to start by talking about the difference between technique and healing." I walked to the center of the room, abandoning the formal podium. 2 years ago, my sister Jessica was brought to this hospital with injuries that statistically should have killed her. The surgery that saved her life wasn't just about medical technique. It was about understanding that every patient is someone's child, someone's hope, someone's future. A resident in the third row raised her hand. "Dr. Chen, how do you maintain emotional objectivity when operating on family members?" I smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought us all to this moment. "You don't. Professional distance is important, but it shouldn't cost you your humanity." The night I operated on Jessica, I used every technique I'd learned in medical school, every innovation I'd developed in Afghanistan, every insight I'd gained from treating hundreds of children. But what made the difference was remembering that she was the little girl who used to bandage her dolls and dream of being a doctor. Jessica shifted in her seat, and I could see her taking notes with the intensity she'd once reserved for dismissing my career. Last month, she'd published her first research paper on the psychological impact of family member surgery on patient outcomes. Her attending physician had called it remarkably insightful for a second-year perspective. "The most important lesson I can teach you," I continued, "isn't about surgical technique or medical innovation. It's about communication. For years, my family didn't understand my work because I'd given up trying to explain it. I'd learned to hide my achievements rather than risk having them diminished. But healing, real healing, requires connection, understanding, and the courage to be vulnerable with the people who matter most." After the masterclass, as residents approached with questions about career paths and surgical techniques, I watched my family interact with the medical environment that had once seemed so foreign to them. My father was deep in conversation with a biomedical engineer about instrument design. My mother was talking to a military veteran about the challenges of transitional healthcare. But it was Jessica's conversation that moved me most. She was talking to a young resident who looked frustrated and overwhelmed. "My family keeps asking when I'm going to specialize in something less stressful," the resident was saying. "They think neurosurgery is too demanding, too risky. They want me to choose family medicine or dermatology, something, quote, more manageable for a woman." Jessica nodded knowingly. "I used to think my sister was wasting her talents in what I thought was a dead-end nursing job. I had no idea she was literally pioneering surgical techniques that save children's lives. I spent years trying to help her find something, quote, more realistic, while she was already exceeding every dream I'd ever had." The resident looked surprised. "Your sister is Dr. Chen?" "My sister is Lisa," Jessica corrected gently. "She happens to also be one of the most innovative neurosurgeons in the world. But first and always, she's the person who taught me that greatness isn't about recognition, it's about dedication to something larger than yourself." That evening, we gathered at my Baltimore apartment for our monthly family dinner, a tradition that had evolved from obligation to celebration. The walls were now covered with photos from medical conferences, award ceremonies, and family moments that bridged both worlds. "You know what's beautiful about this?" my mother said, raising her wine glass. "For years, we were so afraid of losing Lisa to her success that we tried to keep her small. What we discovered is that her greatness was never the problem. Our inability to see it was." As I looked around the table at these people who had learned to celebrate rather than diminish each other's achievements, I realized that the most important surgery I'd ever performed wasn't on any patient. It was on the relationships that had been damaged by fear, misunderstanding, and the dangerous assumption that love requires making ourselves smaller. The girl who had once felt irrelevant in her own family was now surrounded by people who understood that true love means helping each other become exactly who they're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.